Let's go through this example of the proof. So we're given that QR is congruent to QS, RT is congruent to ST, angle QRT is congruent to angle QST, and QT bisects angle RQS. So let's think about what we just read and mark it on the triangle. So it said that QR is congruent to QS. So I can put a line on QR and a line on QS to show that those two sides are congruent. And then RT is congruent to ST. So on RT we can put 2 tick marks, and on ST we can put 2 tick marks to show they are the same length. And angle QRT is congruent to angle QST. So we know that these angles are congruent. And then it says that QT bisects angle RQS. So if you think about what that means, bisect was one of the words that you defined in the last assignment. So it cuts this angle equally in half. So we know that this angle, RQT, will be congruent to this angle, SQT. So we want to make sure as we're doing this that we're writing it down. So you can see here are the first few things that we wrote. So given, 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 you always start with your givens. And then we also marked that those two angles were congruent. And how did we know they were congruent? Well, it was the definition of an angle bisector. I also see that these two triangles share a side. They share QT. Therefore, we know that QT is congruent to QT, and that is due to the reflexive property, again from your notes in the last chapter. So we've already proved that these three sides are congruent to those three sides, and we know that these two angles are congruent to those two angles. So to prove the last angle pairs are congruent, we can use the third angles theorem. So we have the third angles theorem, and then we can mark it on there as well. So I can do 3 swoop marks and another 3. So because we showed all the parts of each triangle were congruent to each other, we now know that triangle RQT is congruent to triangle SQT. And we know it by the CPCTC that congruent parts of congruent triangles are congruent. You're not going to use it for this lesson. This lesson you're just focusing on the shorter ways to show that triangles are congruent. So side, 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 angle, angle, side, angle, and the hypotenuse leg. But this will be helpful for the next assignment to know that CPCTC means that the congruent parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So for this one, we could have actually stopped with the first 3 givens because we did have side, angle, side. So you wouldn't have needed to write this. It would have been a lot shorter of a proof. You wouldn't have needed that. And instead of CPCTC, you would have wrote side, angle, side.